Hi there, I'm Georgie Ainslie, and every week I talk to someone who is a performance person. They could be an athlete from the world of entertainment, business, or politics. They could even be an astronaut. The key link is, of course, that they all know how to perform at the top level, and they can teach us all a thing or two about how to do that in our own lives at whatever it is that we do. Performance People is available wherever you get your podcasts, or of course you can watch us on YouTube, where you can also subscribe, and please do. This week, I'm talking to Ross Adams, CEO of Acast, the world's largest independent podcast platform. Tens of thousands of podcasters use Acast as a hosting platform, including myself and the Obamas, which is the only time you'll ever hear the both of us in the same sentence. The podcast world, though, is booming business right now. Prior to Acast, Ross helped launch Spotify and grew that business across 59 markets, building multi-million-dollar revenue streams in the process. Audio is in his blood.
I saw the data for podcasting. I was blown away by it. And I knew through data, this is going to be a huge success. And I was like, this is amazing. Like, if we get this right, this is going to take over like audio consumption, because, I tell the team this a lot. Get speeding fines. Like, I prefer you to put yourself out there and make your own decision and try something new and get a slap on the wrist, but actually, you learn from that experience than continually just like getting a parking ticket and sitting there, waiting.
So Ross, I was having a moment where I was thinking, how can I improve my podcast? And I was just mulling it over to myself and thinking about different ways and different ideas that I might have that would improve its performance. And I started thinking, yeah, I know I've got someone that I can talk to about this. And I thought, I'm going to at some point give you a call or message you and try and glean as much information as I can from you, because we go way back, don't we, to our school days. I mean, we've known each other since we were sort of 14. So I thought I'll give Ross a call because he knows everything there is to know about podcasts. And then I thought this would make a good podcast. Let's just do all of that
we pretend
on a
to
record.
Know everything about podcasting. Yeah, exactly.
Let's just press that record
I'm here to
button.
help, Georgie.
Yeah, and we'll go.
That's it, and see what happens. Yeah, that's good.
But then I did kind of think, there must be a ton of people out there who are desperate to start a podcast, who want to do something in this world and aren't actually sure how to get going, how to do it, how to approach it, how to monetize it, all those sorts of things. And you do know your stuff on this. So if we just track right back to the beginning, because we're going to do a little bit about talking about you, a little bit of you stuff and a little bit of how-to stuff. If we start in the beginning in terms of a podcast, the podcast world seems to have blown up exponentially over the last few years or so. But it's been simmering, hasn't it, quietly for a while. Have you seen just this huge, sharp rise? And if so, why? What's causing it? What's creating it?
I mean, if you look at podcasting in general, it's a 20-plus-year-old medium, right? So it has been there for a long time. Back in the days when I was in my first job in media sales and radio, podcasting was something that was the new kind of darling then. But then everyone started giving it away as free as part of proposals. So it never really kind of found its value, and it was never really understood. But it was quietly growing in the background. And that's when the Swedish founders of Acast came to me and said, look at this data, we'd love you to help launch this business with us. And essentially, I think there's a few things that really kind of put it on the map. I think one of the big ones was when Apple decided to kind of hard code their podcast app on the home screen of all of the iPhones. And that meant that, podcasting was kind of at the forefront of one of these choice of apps that users could choose from. And then once you get into podcasting and you understand the environment, and now we're in this on-demand world, it's less, radio and it plays it for you. It's I want to choose what I want to watch when I want to watch it or when I want to listen to it. And podcasting kind of suits that habit that's been growing from streaming video. And literally, we launched 9 years ago. And every year we see an uptick in listenership and amount of populations listening. And I think it's just another creative output. Social media has skyrocketed in the amount of people who can start to put content out, and everyone's becoming a creator. And this is just another creative output for people. So there's lots of reasons why it spikes. But, the great thing is, I think as long as you provide the tools, the monetization, and the ability to grow, then that's going to attract more people to do it. So that's what we've kind of done.
Okay, so can anyone do it? Is it open to all?
Absolutely anyone. I mean, podcast, the word podcast and what a podcast is now is getting redefined continually, which is great. Is a video a podcast? In the back old days, it could be like it's an audio file that has to be distributed via RSS. Things are changing now. So you could have a 2-minute podcast, a 1-minute podcast, and absolutely anyone can do it. And as soon as you record it, you can literally, one click and distribute it, and you've got it on Spotify, you've got it on Apple, you've got it on all the podcast apps out there, and you can switch your monetization. So it's super simple. But the hard bit about it, and I'm sure you understand this as well, is growing an audience. It's not as easy as social media, where you can post a video and get 1 million hits and get a viral success overnight. It takes real effort because it's a real craft. So anyone can do it, but those who are successful, it takes a bit of effort.
So is there a sort of a, if you're cooking, there's a great list of ingredients which make a great recipe. Is there anything like that with podcasts? Is there sort of a cheat sheet effectively of what makes a good podcast?
I think, if you think about podcasting, you've got to really think about the structure of your show. I think it's really important to, think about the structure, but also don't be scared to just put stuff out there as well. And I think sometimes when you put stuff out there, you start to listen back to it and you get feedback from your listeners and you start to understand actually it needs more structure. But I think, really thinking about that structure, when you go into it, really think about, this is going to be 12 episodes or 10 episodes, or it's going to be every single week, but make sure you make that commitment. And I think then make sure you're clear with your audience about that as well, so they know what they're getting into. Because I think if you look at, music streaming, committing yourself to listen to a 2 or 3 minute piece of content is pretty simple. You'll know within about 30 seconds if you like the track or not, and you can just skip it. With podcasting, it takes a bigger commitment. So think about things like a trailer. So really people understand what the content's about. So if it's sport, great. Then I'll find sports podcasts. Then it's like, okay, it's Georgie. Great, I'm a fan of Georgie. I'm going to dip into that podcast. And then, so as soon as you listen to the voice as well, then you start to understand the context and what they're talking about, plus the voice. I'm now going to commit to this for 40 minutes. If there's a 3-minute trailer or a 2-minute trailer or a minute trailer, at least that allows you to get used to that podcast within a short space of time before you have to commit all that time. So I think it's thinking about trailers and how do you introduce an audience. And then also think about your socials and how you bring an audience across from the likes of TikTok and Instagram. We find that as a really big way of introducing new audiences to podcasting, particularly TikTok. So, think about, within this podcast, hopefully there's some gems that I might say, and you can cut that into a short video, post that on TikTok, and that might bring an audience in from there to the long form. I doubt it, but you never know. So, yeah.
Do you not find, though, that it's already, we're talking about this growing marketplace of podcasts. There are so many out there. How do you stand out? How do you make a difference? How do you make yours different from everybody else's that's out there? There's ones that are 2 hours long, an hour long, 20 minutes, 3 guests, 1 guest, 2 guests. How do you identify what it is that's going to make you stand out from everybody else other than who you are? Is it enough just to be who you are? Probably not.
It can be in certain aspects, but that's where I think you really need to think about the structure of the show, and understand, how you're going to, how if a listener's going to engage for 40 minutes and they're going to spend 40 minutes of their time in this, how can I structure it in a way that is meaningful and giving something to them? So I think that's where you really need to plan your podcast. You can't do just if you do a chat, maybe it's that interesting that people will listen. But I think, having a structure, you look at podcasts like one of my favorites is the Rugby Pod, and they kind of talk about, a bit of banter at the beginning, a bit of them. Then they talk about kind of the international matches, then the kind of Premiership, and then they do the good, the bad, the ugly at the end. So it's a nice little structure. So every single week, I know if I'm going to commit my an hour's time listening to that, I know exactly what I'm in for. So it's really important to think about that structure before you go into it. Podcasting is one of those amazing mediums though, where a format can work which might not work in any other medium. Like every single year we have new trends. Last year was about dogs and death. Weirdly, there were a lot of podcasts about dogs and death.
What,
Whereas you
together or
have shows like
separately?
My Dad Wrote a both together and separately, but that became a
Whoa.
trend, and I think it was
Okay.
more about health and wellness and talking about death and how there was a lot of kind of self-help podcasts around that, basically. So again, there's certain weird trends. I was going to say there's one podcast in the UK which became the biggest podcast in the UK a few years back, and that was called My Dad Wrote a Porno, and it was an absolute standout success. The biggest podcast in the UK. Anyone listening on the tube laughing, you kind of with headphones on, they're listening to that show. That show couldn't really have worked in any other medium. They made it work live and they made it work everywhere else. But that shows that you can be very creative within podcasting, but certain formats will actually only suit podcasting. But every single year there's something new. And yes, there's 5 million podcasts out there. But if you think about music tracks, music artists, there's like 30, 40, 50 million artists. So by no means have we reached the peak at all. We're way away from that. So I think if you find a niche and you find something you're really interested in, you've got something to say, give it a crack, just put it out there and see what happens.
You mentioned My Dad Wrote a Porno, and that's a great name, isn't it? It's a great name for a podcast. How much does a name matter? How much does a good name give you some weight and carry you to a certain degree?
Yeah, I think name and also I think cover art's really important, because this is an on-demand medium. So, you're seeking out sports podcasts, you're going to scroll through, and actually something that jumps out on you is super exciting. And then I think also changing the episodic cover art is also super important. So it might be that you're interviewing a really interesting guest like Jeremy Clarkson, and actually having them on the cover might attract that Jeremy Clarkson fan to dip into that content. So I think cover art is a really, really big part of it. And name is also very key. So have a think about that, have a search for what's out there already and how you're going to position yourself, and then think about the trailer and hopefully pulling audiences in. But you've got to commit to it. It takes time.
Yeah, that's so true, isn't it? It's kind of one of the sort of holy grails of sport and performance within sports teams is that commitment and that consistency bit of just always being consistent. It's the kind of old age sort of adage of the practice makes perfect, and the 10,000 hours rule and all that kind of stuff, isn't it? It's that being consistent and putting things out. I completely cocked up because we went through a period where we didn't upload anything for 3 months that was new and fresh and exciting content. And the audience just drops off the cliff, right? Because they're like, well, where are you? Where you've gone? We've moved on over here. We're busy with this new podcast. And you sacrifice a lot in those moments. So yeah, you definitely have to be consistent. That's a big learner, definitely for me. How do you make money out of them? Oh, go on, answer that bit, because you were going to talk about the consistency.
No, I was going to say that's why I think it's really key to say to your audience, this is going to be at the beginning. This is 12 episodes over the next 12 weeks, and that's season 1. So I think when you commit to it weekly, you quickly realize, as you're probably realizing here as well, that you've got to find guests. You go on a holiday as well, so there's a 2-week break, and crap, I haven't got any in the can. So you've got to think about pre-recording 3 or 4 in advance to make sure it allows you time when a podcaster could be sick and therefore they won't turn up, and then suddenly you've got nothing that week. So I think it's really important to consider that as well. But I think, just make sure you're clear at the beginning, and then you don't have those issues. But again, this is the stuff that you find out, by just sticking stuff out there. And that's kind of the best way to learn sometimes.
How do you make money out of them? I mean, some of them will be making some serious money, right? Some of your pods, how many have you got now on your platform? Some of them will be making a lot of money.
We have thousands joining us every single month automatically. We have a service called the Creator Network, which is our white glove treatment. So, that's where you speak to a manager, and, you're experiencing some of that, Georgie, now, which is great. We have over 100,000 globally now. And the way you make money within podcasting at the moment is predominantly through advertising. there are subscriptions, and you can start to build your, kind of your Patreon side of things, and fan club, and engage in more content and deeper, richer content on the side there. And that works for some people, but predominantly 99%, I'd argue, of all revenue earned in podcasting is really from advertising. And that's everything from just straight ads, host endorsed reads, to branded content. Those are kind of the three major ways. But you look at the US last year, the space was valued at around $2 billion being spent in advertising in podcasting. You look at the UK, probably $75 million, maybe $80 million being spent in the UK. So it's a big, buoyant market, but it is going to grow. $80 million in the UK versus a radio market that is $600-700 million. Like, that money will switch over to podcasting. So it is, going to happen. The amount of time that consumers spend with podcasting and then versus marketing is woefully underserved. So there's so much, room here for growth. So I'm very excited about that, and obviously excited for creators, because, it's all about making money for creators, and then they're going to continue to making great content.
Is it going to kill off radio?
I don't think it's going to kill off radio. I think it's going to be complementary, but I think, we are in an on-demand world. You look at linear TV and streaming services. Yeah. You look at how you engage with audio in your car now, and how your children engage with the likes of audio. Are they big radio fans, would be the argument there. And I'd probably hasten to add they're probably not. But I think radio's still got a big place in consumption. I mean, if you look at the average hours spent in streaming music, that hasn't changed for the last 15 years. It's, around 7 hours a week spent with streaming music. But the amount of that time now split between other mediums is really interesting, from audiobooks to podcasts. And I'd argue almost streaming music, half of that is now spent with the likes of podcasting and audiobooks. So, if that's time spent, marketeers need to be where the user, the listener, is spending their time. And therefore, if that's in podcasting, then that's where they should be investing, and they're not investing as much as they should right now.
And who do you think is doing it really, really well? Who are the ones out there that aren't just sort of capitalizing on a moment, but actually have a really great podcast, sort of, like the structure's great, the guests are great, the positioning of it's great. They've thought through every aspect of it and are doing the best job by it.
I mean, there's many podcasts that are doing a fantastic role there. You look at some of the large ones we represent in the likes of UK, Peter Crouch, Shagged, Married, Annoyed, Off Menu. These guys have really found their structure, and they've made it work as part of their busy week, because these publishers and broadcasters aren't broadcasting just podcasting. They're doing TV, they're doing, live sport. They're doing so many different kind of areas. But making time for podcasting highlights that actually podcasting is making them the revenue they need to warrant spending that time with it. And that's where kind of Acast comes into that, and makes sure that we are making them the money they achieve. So I think those kind of podcasts are doing a fantastic job. But then there's lots of niche podcasts that are doing fantastically well, but are never going to reach the mass audience because they're niche. But if you look at that niche, they're doing incredibly well. It could be a fishing podcast that's doing amazingly well, which they found a structure that works. But they might only need 10,000 listeners. And you know what? 1,000 might subscribe and pay to subscription extra content. The ads are going to make a small part of what they earn. It's more about the subs. But most is about the ads.
What is there anything that you shouldn't do? Is there sort of like a don't go there, a do's and don'ts list? Is there stuff that you're like, oh my God, that's a massive mistake? What on earth are you thinking?
I mean, it's funny because a lot of people say, we don't need another interview podcast because there's so many out there. Like, I think that's wrong. I think there's room for growth in every area. But I think if you look at the likes of Apple Podcasts, and you really delve into each of the categories and have a look at each of the categories, you can start to see where actually some are really woefully underserved. And if that's a niche and an area that you're an expert on, and you've got something to say, then that's probably a good place to start. Do's and don'ts, I think, think about your audience. They're committing a huge amount of time here. So If you're going to ramble on for a long time, make sure you have the right things to say, and it's actually worth their time engaging. Otherwise, they're going to waste the time and tune out. So I think the structure is really important, which we mentioned earlier on. So really think about that structure and think about the time that someone's spending with it, and is it worth it?
Is there something in releasing a series and episodes over, like you say, like 12 in this series or 10 in this series, as opposed to releasing every single week? Is there a particular does it come down to, because you must know this with your data, does it come down to when it's released and at what time of the day, even what time of the, you must hone into that really, really carefully and be able to see patterns emerging there. Is there something in that? Is that how detailed you can get?
Definitely. And I think if you look at how people consume podcasts, you might have 35% of people consume podcasts while working out, but their workout is pretty similar every single week, the timing wise, right? Your commute is very similar, of course, every single week as well. So whilst it's an on-demand medium, you choose to listen to it when you want to. I'd argue that your listeners will tune in at the same time each week. So I think weekly is really important. So make sure you release it weekly. You give someone 2 weeks, that's enough time for them to forget about your show. So be really clear about that. If it's a very long episode, you can break it into 2 parts, and you can have part 1, part 2 released at the same time.
Yeah.
But make sure you're consistently releasing it at the same time and the same day each week, so your audience again starts to build that habit around your show. Otherwise, it becomes very hard to maintain that audience. As I think you said, you found when you don't have any content to put out for a while, people just disappear. So you've got to be very clear about that.
Yeah, I made that big mistake of inviting my husband on to podcast alongside me. And then what happened is he found that he couldn't make quite the commitment that I could make. And so we were booking people. He's like, oh, sorry, so I won't be able to make that one. Won't be able to make this. I was like, you've got to be here. If you're not here, then, we fall over. And that is
Right.
tricky, right? I think you've got to be really realistic in your own world as well. Like you said, a lot of people are fitting this in around a lot of other things as well. So you've got to make sure it's actually realistic and sustainable.
Exactly. It's because it is a big commitment. So like, it's not only, this hour that we're recording this in, you then got to edit it, or have someone edit it. You've then got to work out your release schedule. You then got to work out your promotional, tactics around this. What parts are you going to cut into promo videos so you can then send that across the social to bring a new audience in? So, and guests are normally doing you a favor by helping appear on your podcast. Yes, it's a promotion for them, but it's also content for you to help yourself monetize. And they're not always available at 3:00 on a Tuesday. It's, they'll be available when they're available, and then you've got to work around that. So it is, commitment is key. And again, you found that, and I think a lot of this you can say, but until you're really in it, you don't really know until you learn yourself. And so you've learned. That's a positive, right?
One of the things that's kind of interesting for me is I always wanted to we're launching a product brand in March time. And I always wanted to have an editorial tone of voice about what we were, what we stood for, all those values and that's those sort of associations. I wanted to put that out there very much before the brand came and the product side of the brand came. How do you sort of reflect on how businesses do that best, marrying the two things together of a product company and a podcast? Because there's a lot of them out there, right, that are doing the same thing.
There are. Again, it comes back to structure, but I also think that from the structure of a podcast, you're doing it correctly. You're seeing this as part of a bigger business. It's not just a standalone thing that is the only thing that can make you revenue. If that can start to wash its face and make you enough money to cover the production and stuff, fantastic. It's going to take some time to get there, but also be brave enough to put stuff out there and then change as you go along. Because you start to realize things that don't work. Like, I can't spend as much time with it. The format needs to be smaller. I need to start asking consistent questions, and you'll only learn that during the process. So I think you've approached it in the right way, because most people will approach it in that podcasting is going to make me a lot of money. It's going to be my only output, and that's fantastic. You've got to see this as part of a bigger thing, and be prepared to evolve that over time, because not many get it right from the word go.
And I suppose there's a skepticism, right, from listeners or viewers with podcasts that sort of start, because of a brand. So they start, it's the other way around. They're a brand and then they create a podcast off the back of it, right? There's going to be some skepticism with that, because you're constantly feeling like you're being sold to the whole time, which is very much not what we're trying to do. We're very much trying to say, this is who we are and what we stand for. And by the way, over here, there is a product line which does the same thing, but you're not committed to either one or the other. You can choose if you want to put them together or not.
Yeah, it's got to be sincere, right? And I think people are committing time to listen to this, so that it's what they're getting off the back of it is either entertainment, learning, both, and also it helps understand a part of your brand that they might not get from just the surface of seeing your brand and buying something from you. So I think it's a really good output, and also to understand the people and culture behind it, because I think story and storytelling is so important to how you feel about a brand. You look at something like I love the story behind Fever Tree. Fever Tree tonic, gin and tonic's one of my favorite drinks. Is an amazing brand. I've always loved the brand in itself, but when you kind of delve into the story and why it's called Fever Tree, and it's when they're tapping the tree for quinine, and in the Congo, and actually over there because there's a lot of malaria, they use it as a tree to cure fevers, so they called the Fever Tree. So that's where the name came from. So when you kind of start to understand these brand stories, it becomes super interesting, and they can come through in the likes of long form content like podcasting, and that makes you feel differently about a brand. So I think it's a really powerful medium for that, not just used to, I'm going to sell my product straight away.
You've come a long way. You used to be like a Diamond White kind of a guy, and now you're talking about, Fever Tree gin and tonics.
Yeah, I was. I'm not going to talk about my drinking habits back in the day, but you've got to start somewhere, Georgie.
You do. And how the hell have you ended up here? I mean, that's the other part of this. Like, we've got sort of this how-to piece over here about how to put the best version of a podcast together. But in terms of you, how did you end up here? You're talking to me from your home in New York. You're CEO of this massive podcast company. I think it's the world's, I'm going to read it out. Actually, I've got the note here. It's the world's largest independent podcast platform. So it's a major deal.
Yep.
What? How?
Thank you. I mean, who'd have thought it, right, Georgie? I